Good evening, good evening, good evening. Thank you guys all for turning up. My name is David Grace. I am chair of the Generations After group, which is a group of descendants of survivors of the Holocaust. And tonight I'm going to introduce a speaker. I have some thank yous to make and some announcements to make, so if you can bear with me while I do that. First off, obviously I thank you guys for coming along. We want to thank the Sarasota Jewish Federation for housing this and for organising that, and specifically we want to thank Orna Nissan, who's standing over there and trying to be shy. Can you give us a wee wave? There she is. Thank you, Orna. Thank you also to Brad, who's over in that corner, who's doing some tech stuff. To Charles, who's from the Manatee Educational TV, who is going to record this for us, and it will be available to watch in due course on metvweb.com, so you'll be able to actually watch this again or send your friends to the links. Announcements. Very important, next week at Robards Arena from 12 to 5, we're having the Interfaith Street Fair in Chuk, which has got the theme of We Love Israel. Please come along and support us. There's going to be lots of fun stuff, and if that doesn't get you going, there's going to be lots of good food there. So that's the real key point. So that's next week, next Sunday, the 27th, 12 to 5 p.m. at the Robards Arena. And on a slightly more serious note, on February the 6th, we have an event at the USF campus, the Selby Auditorium, which will run at 5 p.m. It's called A German Life, and the speaker is phenomenal. It's a gentleman called Bernd Volkswagen. He's not here, so I can safely mispronounce his name. And his story, and if I'm correct that he's German, he started asking his parents about their story of during the war, and this is what happens. This is what he tells the story of his discovery of what his family did during the war, and it leads to a very interesting and informative story.
I just want to say that I heard him, and he's really amazing. It's really worthwhile hearing him.
Right. So now you've heard it twice, and Betty's heard it twice. Oh yeah. Another quick reminder, which I'm going to take for myself, is if you could turn off your cell phones or put them onto mute, which actually I've already done. Okay, so we're good on that. So that A German Life is Wednesday, February the 6th at Selby Auditorium. And do you have to book for that? Do we have to book for that? You have to make your reservations. You go online. Okay, go online to the Federation's website or call in to do that. I think that's what I think. So with the TV cameras here today, things are just a wee bit different. Dr. Vroom's going to speak. We're going to do some question and answer session afterwards, but instead of just standing up where you are and asking your questions, you need to come over to these microphones over here so that people can hear you and so we can record it as well, because I know you've got something interesting to say, and we'll remind you of that a wee bit later as well. So our guest speaker is Dr. Suzanne Vroman. And last year, for Generations After, we were very, very fortunate to have her come along and speak to us. We had a fabulous meeting with her. She's great. She's very patient for all your questions. And we enjoyed her so much that we invited her back again. And Dr. Vroman is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Brad College, where she taught for 22 years. She's also an author of Hidden Children of the Holocaust, Belgium Nuns and Their Daring Rescue of Young Jews from the Nazis. And that's what she came and spoke to us about a year ago, and that was really terrific. And tonight, obviously a different subject, and we're going to be talking about the Jewish passivity during the Holocaust is simply a myth, which I guess you guys already know, but now we're going to get some nice proof on that. So with that, I think that's all we have to do. I'd like to welcome Dr. Susan Vroman to come up to the stage.
Now we have to adjust the microphone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm sorry? Speak a little louder. Louder? Okay. I love to move, and the microphone doesn't want to move, so it's going to be a little bit of a problem, I think. But I'll Like this? No, I'm not supposed to. I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed. All right. Well, it's very nice to have been invited again here. After all, this is Martin Luther King's Day, and we talk about a different kind of resistance. And it's also the day of the inauguration of the new president for the second term. These are all momentous days. And in a sense, I think I'm talking about the Jewish resistance in Europe adds to the subjects of resistance. Why did I choose to speak about that? Because of the myth of Jewish passivity. Because people asked, why didn't they resist? Why did they go to death like sheep to slaughter? And the question, and really, this was in the historiography of the Holocaust. This question arose all the time. It arose because there was an American writer, a historian, Raoul Hilberg, who was an excellent historian. He was the very first one in English to look at all the files of the Germans, at all the German sources, and he wrote the destruction of European Jews. And there he said again and again, the Jews walked passively to their deaths. Now, when you use only German sources, it is of course quite clear that the German sources will not talk much about Jewish resistance. So it took some time for this assertion to be challenged, and for us, for the historians, to show that in effect there was much resistance in Europe, throughout Europe, in every occupied country, Jews resisted. Now, let us talk about the notion of resistance. When we think about resistance, we think of people with a rifle, with a gun, what we call the violent, the armed resistance. But there's another kind, and it's an important one in the case of the Jews in Europe, and that is the non-violent resistance. And I will talk about that quite a bit, I think, because it is very special to us, the non-violence in effect. So what was the first aspect of that resistance? The first aspect of this resistance was that from 1933 to 1939, in other words, from the rise of Hitler to the beginning of the war, of World War II, Jews escaped. Flight was resistance. If you take the Jewish populations of Germany and Austria together, you find that 400,000 Jews from Germany and Austria escaped. Flight was the first resistance. And in my personal case, it was also, if you want, our resistance, because my parents and I lived in Belgium, and when the war started, we lived under German occupation, and we fled. We managed to flee a year after, in 1941. We were not passive. This was not passivity. This was being active, an active agent. We fled all the way to Africa, to the Belgian Congo, as I think my bio said this, and I was told that perhaps I should tell you my story. So in a sense, I'm a survivor. I lived under German occupation, but I managed to escape it after a year of it. Now, that was the first stage, escape. But not only was it during from 1933 to 1939, but escape was an option, though a limited one, also for people who lived near a neutral country. So we have escapes to Switzerland, escapes to Spain, which was the way we went, escapes through Turkey, That's about, in Sweden, of course. This is where the Danish Jews escaped to. But that was active agents, no passivity here. I can assure you that for a year my parents desperately tried to get out of Belgium. There wasn't a visa for any Southern American country that we didn't own. We wanted to leave, my father wanted to leave, and we managed. It's a different story. If anybody's interested, I can talk about it later, but that's not the issue. So the first, if you want resistance, is escape, flight. And people did it. And then we come to the armed resistance. And here you have a very famous one, of course, and it was the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. When did people in ghettos resist? They resisted when they knew that they were being liquidated. In other words, throughout the German occupation and throughout the German persecution, everything was done in a very veiled way. The Jews were sent for labor. They were not sent for extermination. Everything was veiled in the language, especially. So people in the ghettos that were actually, they were a preparation for extermination. The people in the ghettos believed that by working in the German industries in the ghettos, they would survive. When they realized, and very often it was the youth movements who realized it, when they realized they would be liquidated, the revolts started. It was not only in Warsaw, though it is the most famous one. It is one, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt lasted for 4 months. It is quite amazing when you read the reports. They have hardly any arms. Why didn't the resistors, especially the people in the youth movement, not have any arms? In part because the Polish partisans did not want to give or to sell arms to Jews. They begged for arms. Arms were scarce for everybody. But other people in their resistance movement had ways of acquiring it because they had governments. The Poles had a government in London that was really protecting and pushing the Polish partisans. There were 2 Polish partisans' army, the communists and those subsidized by London. And especially those subsidized by London were very anti-Semitic and really started relatively early. And they had their arms that they received through the government, but they were not ready to lend them, to sell them, to give them to the Jews. So the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt was a revolt of people who were desperate. They revolted not because they thought that they would really survive. No. They revolted because they wanted to die with honor. They wanted to die with a kind of a revenge, if you'd like. Ill-equipped, certainly, but with the hope of avenging to a certain extent. None of the revolts, none of the resistance really killed Germans in large quantities. That was not the point. The point really was in some ways to die with honor. And that is what happened certainly in the Warsaw Ghetto. It also happened in the Białystok Ghetto, where the youth movements organized the resistance, which never succeeded. You cannot speak of success. You have some Germans that die. That is all there is. People are hopeless in effect, but they want to die with arms in their hands. So you have those 2, but it's not all. The archives show us that there were armed revolts in many ghettos. Among them, in Krakow, for instance, where we have the words of one of the defenders who said, "For the 3 lines in history that we are going to have, it is worth dying." His name was Daniel Liebeskind, in effect. So you have the ghettos that resist, hopelessly, hopelessly. Don't ask for results. That's not the point here. And then you also have revolts in concentration camps and in extermination camps. Concentration camps had many deaths. People were dying, of course, but they were not set up specifically for extermination. There were revolts in those camps, and there were 3 revolts in the extermination camps, in Sobibor, in Treblinka, and in Auschwitz. Now, 2.5 million Russian prisoners were killed by the Germans in camps. However, nobody ever asked, why were the Russians passive? Why didn't they resist? Why only was the question asked of Jews? Why were the Jews accused of passivity? The revolts in the camps and in the extermination camps were the only revolts that occurred during the whole world, and they were led by Jews. Now, the one in Treblinka, 750 inmates escaped, but most of them were caught and killed. About 70 people survived that camp. In Sobibor, I have to look at my notes. I don't like to use notes, so if you excuse me, I won't tell you the exact number. But what happened after the revolt, the Germans did away with the camp. They eliminated it. They killed everybody who was in it and didn't use the camp anymore. And Auschwitz, there, it was the Sonderkommando that made the revolt. What is the Sonderkommando? The Sonderkommando were the people who had the task of taking the bodies and burning them. And they had heard that they were going to be liquidated. And they, in effect, had nothing to do anything with, except that there were some women who worked in the munition factory. And through them, they acquired some explosives. And what they did in 1944 was to cause the explosion of the 4th crematorium in Auschwitz. It's the only explosion throughout the whole war. And both Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi talk about the execution of the people who had been involved in this revolt. Among them was a woman, Robota, and she shouted before she was hanged, "Chazak ve'ematz," be strong. And both Wiesel and Primo Levi describe how she died, in effect. So, no resistance, yes resistance. Throughout, Jews also served in the undergrounds of the different countries. For instance, in Western Europe, the first urban guerrilla in Paris, people who mowed down some Germans in Paris, were Jews in a Jewish partisan unit in the city of Paris. In Belgium, the Jewish partisans tried to burn the index cards of the people who were to be deported. They also killed a collaborator with the Nazis. They were the first. So there is no passivity here. We have to forget once and forever that Jews were passive. No. They fought in Italy, they fought in Greece, sometimes in specific Jewish units, and sometimes together with the resistance of the other countries. Either way, but they fought as Jews. They had a special reason, if you'd like, because they were going to be exterminated entirely. So that is about all I will speak about at this moment about the armed resistance, because that is not, the point was really not the successes and the triumphs. the Warsaw Ghetto revolt really served as a symbol of the Jewish resistance. It has become really an iconic image of resistance, and it certainly served to disprove the the anti-Semitic myth of Jewish passivity. But it was done for, what were the motivations? It was for honor, it was for revenge. You cannot really take the numbers exactly of how many Germans were killed. That is not the point. In a certain way, I am much more drawn to the nonviolent resistance. And here we have a great variety of happenings, in effect. Because if you look at ghettos, ghettos were set up as crowded, as places where disease was rampant, as places for starvation. And one of the interesting aspects of the resistance was, how do you resist starvation? Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were to receive 300 calories a day. This was the allocation. How do you raise that allocation to 1,000? Even 1,000 calories is not much. By smuggling. It's hard to think of smuggling as resistance, but it was. It really maintained the people. It prevented a raw starvation. There would have been nobody left if there hadn't been any smuggling. It was a strong resistance. It was not violent. It wasn't with arms, but it was there. It said, we want to survive. We're not going to die. We want to survive. So smuggling was very important. You had also a whole array of activities in the ghettos. Think of the ghettos as crowded, as 10 people living in one room, as diphtheria and all other kinds of diseases. I don't know what you have seen. These were places that were very difficult to live in. And yet, in many ghettos, you had a very vibrant cultural life. It was as if, instead of becoming dehumanized, through the cultural life, the people were saying, we are human. We have needs. We want to be counted. We want to survive. What kind of cultural activities? Let me give you one that I was always very touched to find about, and that is the Oneg Shabbat archives. I don't know whether any of you have heard about it. Usually when we say we go to an Oneg, it's nice, it's something like nice, a little bit of food. Oneg Shabbat is the joy of Shabbat. This was a group of historians led by Emanuel Ringelblum, who early, from the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto, met on Shabbat and called themselves Oneg Shabbat. And what they did was to document widely exactly what was happening. They wanted to give information, documentation, knowledge. How do we know what happened in the ghetto of Warsaw? We know because of the Ringelblum archives. They collected something like 30,000 documents, and they hid them. They hid them in 10 metal boxes and 3 milk cans. And they were found after the war, except for 1 milk can. And this way we know what happened. We know about the head of the Jewish Council who committed suicide when he was told about the liquidation of the ghetto. The liquidation means that all the inhabitants are trucked and taken to extermination centers. This Oneg Shabbat really wanted documentation. It wanted information. It was working for the future. It is incredible that during a time of hardship, what was of concern was to let the world know, to see that there is a future, so that the world will see, will know It is really, we have been called the people of the book. And perhaps for me, the Oneg Shabbat archives are the epitome of what people of the book do. There were archives in the Vilna ghetto as well. Divo in the Vilna ghetto served as a center where the resistors met as well. They also took documents. In the Theresienstadt ghetto, which is called today we call it Therezien. Theresienstadt was a German name. And to Theresienstadt were deported all the intellectuals, if you want, from Czechoslovakia, also German Jews, Austrian Jews. It was a ghetto that at one point served, as you probably know, as a model ghetto. The Red Cross came to visit it. They arranged, it was like a Potemkin village, it was imaginary. And they showed well-fed inmates. They did it all for the Red Cross so that the Red Cross could go back and say to the world, the Jews are very well treated in those camps. Well, they weren't. The Theresienstadt ghetto was a ghetto like all the others. People died in Theresienstadt. My grandmother died there. She had been deported from Germany. They had disease, but they had a tremendous amount of cultural activities. They wrote an opera for the children, Brundibar, that the children performed. They also, imagine, they performed 16 times the Verdi Requiem for the Germans, for the German troops. In other words, they gave the Germans the opportunity to think, in the Requiem, you know, the day of judgment arrives. And they sort of, in an ironic way, by playing the Requiem 16 times, they told in effect to the Germans, this is going to be, you're going to have your judgment day. Altogether, music in the ghettos was very, very important, but especially in Theresienstadt. And then they had places for painting, and they had places for poetry. They had readings. They had a vibrant social, cultural life. Now, I don't want to paint here a heaven. It wasn't like that at all. They were starved. They were hungry all the time. It was a ghetto like all the others, but it sort of mobilized all its cultural resources, and people responded to that. I could continue at length. I have a tendency to speak too long, so if you do get bored, look at your watches, and I will stop. It was true for the Warsaw Ghetto as well. And here you have also, for instance, you had clandestine, all schools were abolished. You had clandestine schools in Warsaw, high schools. You had a choir that sang, actually, as the Warsaw Ghetto was liquidated. There was a farewell concert by the choir in the Moria Synagogue. They had, according to Ringelblum, 600 minyanim. Of course, every one of them illegal. You had also in the Warsaw Ghetto a tremendous development of social welfare, where what they organized, the very crowded conditions in blocks of about 200 apartments with heads, and they tried to equalize the blocks that were wealthier, where people had kept more of their belongings, were told in effect to share. You had soup kitchens, you had doctors and nurses, you had an orphanage, the orphanage that was led by Korczak, who, given the possibility of leaving the ghetto, refused and went with the orphans to his death in Auschwitz. It was a developed social, I hate to use the term social system, but there were cultural activities, social activities, and I'm forgetting clandestine newspapers, 50 of them. just for Warsaw itself. So what you have is people who refuse to be dehumanized. In effect, it's very important, and it's something to remember, that resistance needs to be, the term of resistance needs to be made broader. It needs to be enlarged. It needs to encompass both armed resistance and non-armed resistance, in effect. So that, please, if you go out of here with remembering one thing, just remember that we are trying to extend the meaning of the word. It's full of, one can really, it's quite amazing if you read the Ringelblum archives of the tremendous amount of activity. We wouldn't have known if we didn't have the Oneg Shabbat archives, in effect. And it's true for other places as well, but I'm just taking certain examples. Now you have to bear with me for a minute, because I think I have forgotten what I do next. Or if I can remember, I would say, if we leave this non-armed resistance in the ghettos, let us go to the camps. And there also, we know from diaries that have been found, there the task, the Germans were experts at dehumanizing. I have here a quote, if I took the time to find, from Primo Levi, saying, they first wanted our souls in the camps, and then they could kill us, then they could kill our bodies. So you had the whole process of the shaving, the dehumanization, the dirt. So that, in effect, in the camps, what was difficult was to remain human. And it was done. As in some cases, people even said Kaddish. In some cases, people managed to keep themselves more or less clean. And there was one example that was given by Yehuda Bauer of Hanukkah in Auschwitz, where the person who writes says, we had found a piece of wood. With our spoons, we made holes. We took some cardboard, we lit it, and we sang Ma'oz Tzur. So here you have it. You have the desire not to lose all traditions. In some ways, to do away with the everyday life, with the cruelty of everyday life, the presence of extermination all the time, with wanting to recapture something of the life that had been before. Now, let us expand this notion of resistance beyond the cultural. And let us say that resistance also meant rescue. And here we have the whole question, when I said at the beginning, the escape, well, it continued. It continued throughout the war. But especially during the war, what we have as resistance is the rescue of children. You may know that 1.5 million Jewish children were exterminated during the war. 100,000 survived. And a large proportion of these really were rescued. They were hidden. They were hidden either to be visible or invisible. Invisible would be if they were hidden in a hole or in a closet. Or they were visible, so that they were in non-Jewish families, or they were hidden in institutions. And that's really what I specialized in when I wrote my book about the children who were hidden in Belgium, in Belgian convents. The convents in Belgium were very important, and they agreed to hide Jewish children. And they hid, out of the 5,000 Jewish children that were saved in Belgium, 3,000 children were saved in these convents. In France, you had, before, France had occupation in 2 times. Until 1942, part of France had an unoccupied zone and an occupied zone. So what the Jewish organizations did was to create in the unoccupied zone, to create houses to shelter children. When the Germans invaded the whole of France, and then, of course, this was critical. One needed to do away with these children's homes. As a matter of fact, one, a very well-known one, is Lisieux, the whole house, this movie Au revoir les enfants, which some of you may have seen, really talks about it, about a whole home that was taken in its entirety. One person came back after the war. So these homes that existed had to be dispersed. And they dispersed over 7,000 children to non-Jewish families and institutions. The Quakers, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, which was a whole village in France where Jews were hidden and especially children were hidden. Now, I'm sort of slipping into rescue by non-Jews. However, let me come back to my subject. To arrange this hiding was done by Jews, and I'm insisting on that. Jews saved Jews. Why am I insisting? I'm insisting about it because we recognize the righteous Gentiles. You know, Yad Vashem has a special procedure where it thanks the people who hid Jews without monetary rewards. It's called the righteous Gentiles. The righteous among the nations, really. It's taken from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. That's fine. Yes, much of the saving could not have been done without some help. But, in effect, the initiative was taken by Jews. And that Yad Vashem has forgotten. There is no distinction, no recognition, no honoring the Jews who helped the Jews. Their attitude has been that it's normal for Jews to save Jews. Well, maybe it's normal in normal times, but it wasn't normal in those times. So there's some of us who are really fighting for recognition in one way or another of Jews who saved Jews. And we are, in effect, talking a lot about that. We haven't finished studying it. We want to see, in many cases, how children saved children, brothers who saved siblings. We see the children as active agents, and they saved. They may have saved parents, and themselves and their siblings. We don't know yet. We haven't seen enough. We haven't studied enough. But that is very important. So on the one hand, we expand the notion of resistance, because rescue is resistance. And on the other, we want to remember that Jews save Jews. And let me add here that in the case of children who were separated from their parents, it was dangerous to save children with their parents. It's impossible, really. Especially not in Eastern Europe, but it's true for Western Europe as well. Who were the first rescuers? It was the parents. The parents who had the courage to give their children to strangers whom they may have not known, they had never seen, for their children to be taken where they wouldn't know. The addresses were not given out, so that if the parents were tortured, were taken and tortured, they would not betray. And they made the decision against nature. Families are supposed to stay together. But here they made the decision to take the children, to allow them to be taken and to allow them to be rescued. So the rescue of the children is if you want, a shining aspect. It's a very successful aspect of the resistance. It permitted the Jewish people in some sense to renew itself. Now, I probably have forgotten a lot of things. And what I think I need to expand upon is about the difficulty of resisting, of the difficulty of why people did not try to escape from camps. And I have extracts from here from Primo Levi. He said, "We had no shoes, we had no clothes, we were strangers. Where would we go? The fence was electrified. Where could we go, in effect?" You needed an organized resistance. You needed groups to do so. It was also, let us look at the populations that surrounded the camps. Poland was inimical. Poland was inimical to Jews, so was Lithuania. It was the populations, by looting what the Jews owned, they were really, in effect, became collaborators. They did not want the Jews to survive. The better they would, if they looted, they wanted the people, the rightful owners, to disappear. So you have populations that are inimical. You don't have arms. You have, when you think of all the obstacles to any resistance, it is really extraordinary, as many have said, that there was as much resistance as there was. It was actually, and it was often, except in the case of children, a hopeless resistance. It wasn't going to achieve very much, but it was resistance in any way whatsoever, indeed. I wanted to, I think I have probably forgotten quite a bit in my notes. I have like 20 pages here. And perhaps, if you will excuse me, I will either look at them or I will end, and maybe some things will come out in the questions. I wanted to finish my talk by reading you a poem that was found in Theresienstadt. There were lots of paintings and drawings that were found, writings that were found in Theresienstadt. And I didn't know how to end. So I decided I would like to read you a poem that was found. It was written by a boy called Pavel Friedman. He was probably between around 15, 16 at the time. And this is what he says. Excuse me 1 minute. Here it is. It's called The Butterfly. The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against the white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly, way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks, I've lived in here, pent up inside the ghetto, but I have found what I love here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut branches in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto. This was written in 1942. He was exterminated in 1944. Thank you.
I would like to know more about your family history.
The question is here that my family history. Well, we were just lucky. I must say that I was haunted by the fact that we were lucky, and I think writing the book was a way of really coming to grips with having survived and having, survivors have a kind of I won't call it a survivor complex, but they ask why they survived, why they were lucky, and so they want to give back in a sense. And I did it by teaching the Holocaust for many, many years, like I've been teaching now over 30 years. I taught the very first Holocaust course that was given at Vassar in the early 1970s. One did not teach the Holocaust in any American university until the 1970s. The war ended in 1945. And in writing my book, where I could have been one of the children hidden in the convents, and So now I'm less haunted in a way. But we went all the way to the Belgian Congo, where well, how could I say, we learned what colonialism is. We were very, very lucky to be there, in part because my father had received visas for the Congo from an employee of his who wanted to collaborate with the Nazis and who said, I will give you the visas to the Belgian Congo if you give me your business. And my father had the wisdom to give his business, which he would have lost anyway. And we tried, and we left with all kinds of false papers. And we left through Spain. Spain, remember, was one of the countries. And then Portugal, and then Angola, and then the Belgian Congo. And there I became a Zionist and created the Jewish Scout movements and so on. And I won't bother you anymore on that one. Yes?
Okay. I had a question, one form of resistance that you did not mention, and I don't know if it was, you had it in mind but didn't mention it, was sabotage.
Oh yes, of course. I had a whole sentence here saying what the resistance, the resistance movements, what the people in, and I did not mention the partisans either. Come to think of it, the Bielski partisans are well known, for instance. Well, I have there were many partisans. In other words, when you fled, when you managed to flee the ghetto, especially in an area that had forests, you tried to join the partisans. Now, until the Soviets organized their partisans, you would fall into roaming bands of anti-German people who were also perfectly ready to kill you, and to kill Jews. So it took a while for the Soviets to organize and to have the partisan units that Jews could join. And the Bielski brother Tuvia, when he in the book of Defiance, written by Nahama Tek, says it was more important to save people than to kill the Germans. This is the essence of what resistance meant. So there were millions and millions of Germans, and they could not all be killed. They didn't have the arms. But the question was, how do you have the Jewish people survive? And the Tuvia Bielski said that very clearly, that for him, lives of Jews were more important than the killing of Germans. Sabotage, certainly. Sabotage also in munition factories. When there's a whole area of things that I didn't talk about, and that is what happened in the ghetto industries. There was sabotage inside the ghetto industries as well, like when people had to, for instance, sew uniforms, right? They would sew 2 right arms, right? And things like that. But then when it was traced back to them, then there was, in some cases they were killed. So yes, blowing up bridges, blowing up trains. By the way, in Belgium, it was the Jewish resistors who attacked a deportation train. Well, actually, it's not quite. There was 1 Jew and 2 non-Jews together. They attacked a deportation train, and they opened a wagon of which 17 people jumped. Some were taken back and killed. But in that particular train were partisans that had been caught and were taken to Auschwitz. And they had smuggled aboard, they had smuggled saws. So there were about 200 people who jumped out of this train. It's the only deportation train that was ever attacked during the whole war. And I wrote an article about this, and I haven't quite found out why nowhere else was there any attempt at really trying to try to attack a deportation train. People escaped from deportation trains, depending on the area and depending whether the train slowed down, depending whether they had the means. Does that answer your question? It's a long answer.
I assumed sabotage was on your list, and you.
You were absolutely right. It's on page 17.
I want to thank you for your excellent speech. I'm a docent at the Holocaust Center in West Bloomfield, and now I have something really positive to say to the children that come through. I'm also a hidden child, and I didn't realize until I was older how brave my parents were, that they were able to get forged papers. And in the ghetto, they just took off their armband, and they were so brave. I don't have any memory during the war, but we were on the first ship after the war.
What country?
Well, I was born in Poland, but I was hidden in Germany with another family, of all places, who thought that I was Polish or German, a Catholic. But my parents survived, and I feel like you, very, very lucky to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Is that all? Is that all the questions? There's nothing else?
I have a question.
Oh, good.
I have a question as well. You talked very briefly about West. Can you hear me? You talked very briefly about West and East. You know, we hear lots about stuff that happened in the West, in Holland and Belgium, and obviously kids getting hidden. Anything from the East? Anything there anything good from there?
Well, I would say that all that I said about the armed resistance in the camps and in the ghettos is all in the East. The West had no ghettos. And you know, the reason I think that it had no ghettos was that they didn't have surrounding populations that would have allowed the ghettos to be used, though they had places like where they concentrated people before they sent them for extermination. Westerbork in Holland, Drancy in France, and Malines in Belgium, speaking of the West. But you have much greater difficulties in the East than you had in the West because of the surrounding populations, and also because in the West, Jews could join resistance movements. In the East, it was more problematic. As I said, the Polish underground that came from London did not accept Jews for a very, very long time. And it's only in 1943 that the communist underground was really organized, indeed. So there was much less help from the surrounding population. And there was also, in a sense, the penalties were harsher in the East. You would be, if you were found to have hidden a Jew, you would be shot on the spot. In Belgium and in France, you would be sent to a concentration camp, which is nearly like a death sentence, but it's not exactly the same. The penalties in Poland were absolutely... There was also one aspect that I forgot to talk about, and that's collective responsibility. What you did would affect your family and your whole community. It was a weapon that was used all the time. So if you wanted to resist, if you wanted to sabotage, would you endanger your family? So that after the war, there were people who had resisted who did not want to tell that they had resisted during the war because they had endangered their families, indeed. So the whole concept of collective responsibility made it all so much harder, indeed. Yes.
You've mentioned the Soviets. Was there any attempt by the Office of Strategic Services from the United States or Special Air Services, let's say, from the United Kingdom, to organize or try to reach Jewish resistance groups?
It's a very interesting question, because most of the data seems to show that while the resistance movement received arms sent by the different governments in the free zones, the Jews were the only one who didn't receive anything from the air, from any government. They had no home. They had nobody to represent them. They didn't receive anything. Absolutely none. However, in the question of hiding the children, you had, for instance, Quakers that helped, but not officially. You have the Unitarians in the United States sent help for hiding children and for helping people in concentration camps. There's a recent book that has published about that, very interesting indeed. Yes?
I wonder how true it is that the American Jews were really turned their back on the European Jews. I just want to say one thing, that I read a quote from the Bermuda Conference where Rabbi Wise was there, and he said, "I don't want to bring in any of those dirty, unwashed Jews, because then it will be difficult for our elite German Jews in the United States." And I know that this is in fact so, and I wondered why the American Jewish community was not more involved as the European partisans were.
It's a very painful and a very good question indeed. There is a wonderful book that was written by a historian who is the son of a minister, he's not Jewish, by David Wyman. And the book is called The Abandonment of the Jews, where he shows from the archives the attitudes especially of the State Department. Right? And there are also, you're taking Rabbi Wise's words, but there were words from among the British saying, we can't have, what are we going to do with the Jews, you have to realize that even before already before World War II, to be Jewish was stigmatizing, right? You also have to look, I don't know about the saying that you came up with, but when I looked at the material when I was teaching actually the abandonment of the Jews, because my students were also very interested in what did the community do, the Jewish community or the non-Jewish community. And the issue is here that how important were the Jews in America at the time? What positions did they have? It wasn't a situation where they were really intimately linked to the government. There were still Jews that were trying to assimilate into the population. And here you have a president who in effect is interested in finishing the war. The big excuse against helping Jews has always been, we have military priorities. What is important is to end the war. That was the concern. So Jewish community did not have the leverage that you could imagine, that it could imagine today. It simply did not have it. They were first generation, many of them. It wasn't the same. They were not as, it wasn't that, Jews would vote Democratic anyway. So whether he was going to help the Jews in Europe or not didn't matter that much as far as the voting is concerned. See, politically, they were not important. So there are a lot of ramifications here. You know who wanted to really do something was the Bergson group. They had a big demonstration on Madison, I think in one huge hall, and they were considered in effect as a kind of a marginal group indeed. It was until Morgenthau became Secretary of the Treasury that Roosevelt created the War Refugee Board. It was late, but it helped because it could bribe. I haven't talked much about bribery, but bribery, the moment you have money, you have leverage. So they managed to use money to save people in certain circumstances, but late in the day. The harrowing aspect of it all is that the Hungarian Jews were exterminated late in the war, and that if there had been some more intervention, they could have been saved, even in spite of Wallenberg. And by the way, data from Budapest shows that much of what Wallenberg did was incredible, really, but he did it thanks to the Zionist Jews movements that gave him the list of Jews, that helped him with forged documents. So what you have here is an interaction between a person like Wallenberg and Lutz, Karol Lutz, who was from Switzerland. Both of them created safe houses. But they did it with the help of the Zionist youth movement. And Yehuda Bauer, who was the specialist very much in that part of in the history of the Holocaust, talks a lot about the Zionist youth movements in Budapest, who gave tools, in effect, who allowed Wallenberg and Lutz to do their part. So my sense is that the community was, and I'm not sure of what I'm saying, that the community was not important to Roosevelt in a sense. What was important to him was to end the war. He didn't, there's this whole discussion about why wasn't Auschwitz bombed. It's a long, long discussion. What would it have done? It's as if, the whole issue in history, if only we had done this or the other. I wouldn't indict the Jewish community as harshly as the words indicate one should. They were, in many ways, people knew, but there's a difference between information and understanding. There's a big difference. You can be informed of something, but you cannot always understand the enormity of it. And in general, the public did not understand the enormity of the extermination. So that's why you see soldiers so surprised when they come to Dachau, when they liberate Dachau, for instance. People simply had no sense of the enormity of the extermination. And neither, in all the years after the war, did this extermination become part of a social discourse. You don't hear much about the Jewish genocide in the 1940s and in the 1950s after the war. You only begin to hear after Eichmann's trial. Until then, each nation is busy with the war, with its resistors. Everybody wants to find martyrs and wonderful people. And they don't talk much about Jews until the 60s, until Eichmann is being tried and all the history comes out. But until then, the Jewish genocide is not part of the social discourse. So it's not only with Americans, it's true for Europe as well. Indeed. Any more? Yes?
Was there any information about how many of the children who were hidden away from the Jewish community in non-Jewish homes, how many of them did not get back to the Jewish community?
Unfortunately, it's a question that has no answer. It's very hard to know. If the children were hidden through an institution, you can trace it. But if they were hidden by their parents and the parents disappeared, you have no way of knowing. Sometimes a relative comes and tries to claim a child, and you had fights in courts in Belgium about that, in other countries as well. We don't have the figures. We really simply do not have the figures to answer you.
You very briefly touched about the Hungarian Jews, and I'm a survivor from Hungary. And you mentioned Lutz, and I don't know if you neglected or you don't know about it, I'm sure you know about it, about Rezsé Kastner. He saved close to 1,700 Jews by dealing with Eichmann in Hungary during the war in the most terrible times.
Yes.
He had the guts to deal with him, and I am one of the people who he saved. So I could not neglect mentioning him. Israel Kastner, he saved close to 1,700 Jews. And then after the war, after we were already safe, and we were deported to Bergen-Belsen, regardless of all the effort, but we came to Switzerland 5 months later. We spent 5 months in camp. And after he came to Switzerland, he went back to Germany. And with Bacher, he went from camp to camp to camp to camp to beg them not to take the Jews to Auschwitz, but to let them walk to Germany because they needed labor. And just by that act in and of itself, and his bravery to do that, he saved another 10,000 to 20,000 Jews.
You are you part of the story, but not the whole story, the one about him going to the camps. The negotiations took place. You have to take into account that it was already the end of the Reich, right? So he managed to... there were other attempts by Brandt to have Jews for trucks.
That was his attempt, actually. Brandt was working with him.
With him, yes. But why was he assassinated?
Why was he assassinated? Because of a jealous Jew in Israel who simply, his family did not survive. Our families, not all of them survived. My family didn't all survive. I come from a very large family on both sides of my mother and my father. My father didn't survive. We could not all survive, but instead of giving thanks to those who survived, some Jews felt that shame on you that you survived. You should hang your head in shame that you survived, because the person who rescued you dealt with the Nazis. And you don't deal with your friends, you deal with your enemy. The fact that this person had the guts to come in front of Eichmann in times where he could have shut him in his office and nobody would have blinked an eye, were not taken into account. And there were a lot of factions in Israel at the time that caused such friction. And it came to court, and he was found guilty, and then collaborating with the Nazis in spite of all the facts. And today, later on, he was found not guilty, and one young Israeli who was brainwashed went and shot him and killed him in the street. Today, he's represented in the Holocaust Museum, and he's in Yad Vashem, and he's accepted as a righteous Jew. And she finishes the book by saying, would he have been a Gentile? He would have been a righteous Gentile. But his only problem was that he was born a Jew.
Thank you very much. I remember the controversies also, that the train, the Kastner train, that he put on the train the people that he wanted, and that the people who were not put on the train.
That is a total lie, because he took people from all walks of society. Let me tell you, 500.
Thank you very much for bringing him to you.
I just would like to take this.
Yes, go ahead.
There were 500 orphan children on this train. There were people from the Orthodox community. There were people from the non-believers, the Neolog Jews. There were people that were Zionists. And most importantly, they were out of the 1,700, there were 300 and some odd Jews who had money to pay for all the 1,700 who did not have the money to pay to be rescued. So it wasn't Kastner's pointing out who he wants on that train. There was a Va'adah, a committee, a Jewish committee, and the Jewish committee made the decision what groups of Jews to try to rescue. They were sending them by the thousands. They were sending them by the thousands to Auschwitz each day. Okay? By the hundreds of thousands each day. Barely any Jewish Hungarian survivor. 200 out of 800,000 Jews, I think at the end of the war, there were barely 200,000 Jews who survived. And this was the end of the war. This was not, they didn't enter Hungary until the spring of '44. So, it wasn't his job. 14 members of his family were on the train out of this whole group. The rest were people who were really working, and the Va'adah was the one. They selected people from the city of Kolozsvár, which is today Cluj, today it's Romania, then it was Hungary. And a good portion of the Jews that were put on the train were from Budapest. And the deal was that he will take these Jews and prove to the world that the Germans are not killing all the Jews. That this Jewish group will go to Europe someplace, to Portugal, Spain, to Turkey, wherever we would land, and we will prove to the world that these rumors that they are murdering us is not correct. But Eichmann thought otherwise. Once we got on the train, and it was cattle train, it wasn't the normal train that you sit in, cattle cars, they transported us to Bergen-Belsen. And there we languished, not knowing each day what will happen to us. So for 5 months we were there until we were with Lutz, dealing with him, and through the WADA, dealing with Switzerland, back and forth, and trying to bluff Eichmann with we'll give you trucks, and where would they take trucks, you know? They gave him all the money, the jewelry, whatever they could collect among the Jews, and that's how we survived. But, you know, it's a much bigger story than it seems.
Well, the subject was resistance. So the point she's making is that Kastner was another example.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I thank her very much. I think it's a very wonderful thing that she brought it to the attention.
Okay. I'm a direct descendant of Mordechai Analevitz, the head of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and part of my reason to go on the March of the Living in April is a promise to my father. On his side of the family, they lost literally maybe 50 to 100 relatives. So, and I come from a family of all rabbis down to 1,400, the Kelman and Kalman families, and we're all over the world. So it's a promise, and I very much thank you for your presentation today. It was wonderful. Thank you.
You done?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Berman for a fantastic talk. And also thank you to everybody here for coming along, for participating. I know there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of information to take in, but thank you so much. Also, I look forward to seeing some of you on Sunday, right, at Robards Arena between 12 and 5, where all this great food is. If you have kids or grandkids, bring them along. There's rock climbing and face painting, lots of good stuff. Thank you again for coming.
And music.